Welcome everyone to tonight's presentation on Where the Wild Things Are, Plants for Pollinators, presented by Jaffe Wilder. He is the horticulturist and propagator for Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary and the staff photographer. His recent book, Native Plants for New England Gardens, was released in the spring of 2008, and I highly suggest looking into that after tonight's webinar. Without further ado, I hand it over to Dan. Welcome.
Thank you, Corey. Thanks to the rest of the Mount Grace folks for setting this up and, well, all the land work that you guys are doing. So today is the 1-hour version of a lecture that was originally written as a 6-hour version. So you're going to get the kind of the quicker version of everything that is encompassed in this kind of plants for pollinators idea. Pollinators these days has become quite a buzzword, and it's something that I'm happy for the enthusiasm surrounding it. As we get into this, you'll see that that it's a little more, I guess, robust than it might at first seem. So, you know, with that in mind, instead of hinting at things, let's just jump right into stuff. So what are we doing here today? So when I talk about kind of pollinators, what I really mean is I want to bring life to the landscape. I'm trying to build a healthy ecosystem. The nice thing is that it's rare that you need to kind of pick any single life form to try and focus on. There are times where we might choose to focus on something like the monarch butterfly or the Carner blue butterfly or, you know, an eastern puma. But for the most part, when you're building healthy habitat, you tend to start supporting, you know, large amounts of different life forms. And that's really what this is about. When it comes down to it, for the most part, when people talk about pollinators, they don't actually tend to really mean pollinators all that often. You know, it's not that we're just saying we want to kind of feed the pollinators, but, you know, screw you songbirds, we really don't care about you. For the most part, when we say, you know, plants for pollinators, we're talking about everything. Pollinators being a major part of it and clearly an important part of the landscape. And we'll talk a little bit about which pollinators play which roles on the landscape and which pollinators don't play those same roles. I'm always going to be plant-centric in the way I go about things. I want to talk about which plants are really the kind of stars of the show. Not all plants are created equal. We can kind of simplify things and say, if you want to support healthy ecosystems, just plant native plants and keep it nice and simple like that. That being said, if you start looking into it even more deeply, you'll find that certain native plants really play a larger role than others. Or in some cases, I think the better way of saying it is we understand their role more effectively. We keep learning new things as new research becomes available. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's a plant that I'm going to tell you today doesn't play a huge role that we find out in another, you know, year's time is actually playing a huge role that we knew nothing about. But based on the current science, we can start kind of quantifying which plants really do a lot for us. And I want to bring us into it. And by us, I mean us humans. You know, we are here, we're on the landscape, we're having effects. You know, it would not be realistic to say that, you know, we should just get out of the way and let nature take its course. You know, it's not like we're going to start bulldozing cities and bring them back to bogs and swamps and meadows. So when we start thinking about our role on the landscape and how we can both build a healthy landscape while still coexisting on that landscape, it starts to drive our decisions. We might choose one plant that's really great for the pollinators and the wildlife, but that plant might not be the best plant for us. For a good example, if you want a really great plant for both pollinators and songbirds, go plant a whole bunch of poison ivy. Probably not what people are thinking is a good idea, but it's kind of important to think about how these sorts of decisions kind of fall into the larger category when you start thinking about humans as well as the rest of us. So let's start breaking things down a little bit. What do pollinators really need? I see these lists all over the place these days. As I said, I love the enthusiasm surrounding the whole kind of, you know, save the bee, save the pollinators thing. The problem is a lot of times it's enthusiasm without really any actual knowledge of what's going on. So let's take this list, let's yank these certain plants off the list, assuming the list was talking about native asters, native anemones, native geraniums, which, you know, may or may not be true, but yank those off, and these remaining plants are providing host sites for 14 different pollinator species. You know, 14 species out of all these plants, not great numbers. We could do better. Carex, our native sedge, supports 36 species on its own. That means that this one plant here that does not produce a flower that is visited by any pollinators supports more life than that entire previous list devoid of the native plants. You have things like the marsh-eyed brown that would not exist without carex. We think about, these adult stages quite often, and we sometimes forget about what they were eating before they turned into the butterfly or the moth. And that's where things like your grasses and your sedges and ferns and non-flowering trees can still play a huge role because those leaves are still food. Put the natives back on the list, and all of a sudden we're supporting 216 different species. We've gone from 14 to 216. That's the power of native plants. That's why I can say, if you want to build a healthy landscape, plant native plants and even just leave it at that. We've got 4 species here that we're assuming are native, and we've just supported, I don't know what the numbers are, 200 more species than the previous list. So to kind of put it into a different perspective, think about this. What does the monarch butterfly really need? And when I ask that question, I want you to think about what the butterfly needs, not necessarily the entire life stage, but just the butterfly itself. When you think about it, we tend to think about monarchs and milkweed for good reason, but the monarch-milkweed connection's got nothing to do with the adult stage. It's all about that caterpillar. The caterpillar is a specialist. The butterfly, on the other hand, is a generalist. It'll feed on just about anything. Here it is feeding on an aster. And so when you start thinking about this, you realize that this holds true for a lot of other insects out there. The cecropia moth, for example, does not feed. This adult stage, at least, the moth itself doesn't have a mouth. It cannot eat. It is literally a flying sex machine. It's running around looking for a mate. It's going to mate. It's going to lay eggs, and it's going to set the stage for the rest of the life cycle. And that's where the specialization kicks in. And that's where this importance of specific native plants really matters. In the case of the cecropia, it's our native trees. Again, not for the moth, but for its caterpillar. Things like native cherries, native birches, I believe basswood is on the list, hickories, there's a couple more. It's one of the ones that we would consider specialized, but it's not as specialized as, say, the monarch that only will feed on a single genus. So then there's this idea of which pollinators matter, which is really just a different way of saying what are the different ones doing on the landscape, because I don't think it's fair to say that one life form matters more than another. But again, there's this enthusiasm around saving pollinators. For the most part, save the pollinators means save the honeybee. We hear a lot about saving the pollinators, and the picture is always of this European species. The honeybee is not a native species and doesn't really play the same role as, say, a native bumblebee or a native syrphid fly or a native monarch butterfly. We see things like Save the Monarch, something very specific. The nice thing about Save the Monarch is most of the time, though there's plenty of talk about, planting milkweed, most of it is Save the Monarch habitat. And the great thing about that sort of work is when you save the habitat of a single species, you kind of accidentally save the habitat of a whole bunch of other species. And so campaigns like this can really have a great effect. That being said, when it comes down to my interest in saving the monarch, I want to see its habitat saved, not just the one species that we're talking about. No one ever talks about saving the flies. We have these like non-characteristic insects and other life forms that are just not really mentioned as often. And yet they really should be. It's not just about bees, it's not just about butterflies, it's not just about flies. It's about flies, it's about ants, it's about beetles, it's about, fishers, it's about chipmunks, it's about everything on the landscape. And I include the humans in that. So different animals play different roles. When we talk about pollinators, we're really talking about bees. Our native bees are the most efficient pollinators of any life, kind of out there, much more so than the butterflies, the moths. When it comes down to it, butterflies and moths are actually pretty crappy pollinators. Most of their pollination work is done somewhat accidentally, and it's not the driving factor of what makes them important. In the case of the bees, however, they are the most effective pollinators out there. They exhibit this characteristic called floral consistency. And what that means is that what you're looking at here is a green metallic sweat bee on Dahlia purpurea. It's the purple prairie clover. And this sweat bee is going to feed on this prairie clover and he's going to fly off looking for another flower. And they have a natural tendency to go looking for another purple prairie clover. They want to go from one flower to the next within the same species. That's something that makes them very effective as pollinators, because that means that when he picks up pollen from this purple clover, there's a good chance it's bringing it to another purple clover. If he was to say, go visit an aster next and deposit some clover flower on the aster, it really wouldn't do the plant any good. This is why bees are such effective pollinators and why they're so good at actually doing that job of pollinating one flower to the next. And when pollination occurs, that means you can then get fruit set. Fruit set then leads to viable seed and leads to the permeation of the plant species. Honeybees kind of sit outside of this. I think of honeybees the same way I think about my chickens. They are a domesticated animal. They're kind of like livestock. They are not something that plays a role in the ecosystem in a kind of typical sort of natural ecosystem function sense. They've got a job to do. We take care of them. They give us something in return, whether that be pollination on, say, a built landscape like a farm, or whether it means honey, from the hives or whatever it might be. It's not the same thing as supporting, say, native insect populations that can support a natural meadow or a woodland or something else. They've got their place, but don't mistake honeybee conservation as the same as kind of, ecosystem conservation. Caterpillars specifically have a very important role, not necessarily just as, as turning into butterflies, but as food. Caterpillars represent a really important source of protein, mostly for our native songbirds. What caterpillars are very good at doing is taking the energy stored within plants, usually in the form of their leaves, the minerals, the nutrients, all the amino acids, everything that's in those leaves, the caterpillars eat. And then on one hand, the caterpillar might turn into a butterfly and lead its own life, which is, a great thing on its own. But sometimes you can almost say it's more important for the caterpillar than to get found by a bird. Because it's a very important way of getting the energy stored in plants into the caterpillar, into the bird, and kind of moving it up through the trophic scale. It means that they're very good at kind of distributing energy throughout the entire habitat. And that's a really important function. There's something to be said about the importance of plants as the building blocks of the ecosystem. But the next step in that process is getting that building block energy distributed throughout the ecosystem. And we tend to forget about that sometimes. We forget about the fact that they are important for the fact that they are food. And I don't want you to forget the rest. What you're looking at here is a great golden digger wasp. This is one of our parasitoid wasps. They look mean. They're not at all. I had to poke this guy about 6 times with my finger to get him into the frame so I could take the picture. These are the guys that are going to fly around looking for your tomato hornworms, where they're going to lay their eggs and parasitize the hornworm. And there's a lot of instances of these kind of charismatic sort of insects that play important roles, whether it be things that are helping to eat the decaying bodies of others and help to kind of recycle that material, or things like the parasitoid wasps here, or ants that are very important dispersers of many of our woodland seeds in the area. I want to make sure we don't get stuck on just the bee or just the monarch or even just the fly. Start thinking broader. Think about an ecosystem. And this is where something like a land trust really makes a big difference, because we're setting aside land, keeping it protected and hopefully healthy as well. And you might talk about saving the monarchs on that land, and in the process of saving the monarchs, you set aside land, you saved a lot of different insects, a lot of different life forms. Okay, so this is the question I always get. What should I plant? What is the best plant? And this is a tough question because the simple answer is it depends, and that's always a bit of a cop-out. So let's start looking at some numbers, because there's been a lot of research lately that has helped us to start to quantify the value of different plants. It's at least one way of looking at which one might be the best, or at least which ones are really good. So these numbers come from Doug Talamay's work. Lepidoptera and diversity, by I mean that Lepidoptera are the family of the butterflies and the moths. And so if you look at his numbers, you'll find that oak pretty much tops the list really everywhere on the East Coast. 470 species supported. These numbers can really vary greatly, or vary a little bit at least, depending on your location, but they're good generals. Cherries, willows, all very important. Getting into the herbaceous spectrum, the goldenrods and the asters, back when aster was aster and not about 6 different genera, were considered kind of top of the list. Start moving down the list quite a ways and you find something like lupin. So you got an oak that supports 470 different species. You've got a goldenrod supporting 123. You might think that lupin only supporting 26 is really not as valuable. And this is where these numbers can be a little bit misleading. What this is telling you is species supported, the number of different species supported. The next step of that question is how many of those 470 species that are supported on oaks are also represented in that 410 on cherries and are more generalist feeders. Lupins don't support all that many different insects, but they support quite a few rare and endangered and highly specialized insects. Things like the eastern tail blue or the frosted elfin that'll feed only within the family, the pea family, which is, the family that lupins are mentioned in. Or the Carner blue that feeds not only on lupins, but specifically on our eastern native lupin only. And this is why I'll tell people to plant Lupinus perennis and not plant Lupinus polyphyllus, the common garden lupin, the West Coast species or the hybrids. So don't get hung up necessarily just on the diversity of species supported. Always remember that there's something to be said about not just the number of species, but what species are being supported. Great diversity numbers are one way to start kind of figuring out what is the most valuable, but it's not the only kind of quantifying data that we've got. It's a piece of the puzzle. Then we got to bring humans into it. We can't forget the fact that we are here. So if we start looking at those diversity numbers again, we've got this kind of top 50 plants we could lay out. I might tell you to go plant these top 50 plants. They would include things like ragweed, major culprit of hay fever in fall, not something that everyone wants to be planting. Dock, common garden weed, something that most people will just rip out anytime they see it. Plantain, another one, common garden weed, often just removed kind of, at all times. These are plants that I'm not going to tell you shouldn't be removing, but these are extremely valuable pollinator plants. Black locust. I love black locust. This is a conundrum. I will argue any day that this is not an invasive species, but it's definitely got some issues. It's a funky plant. It supports a ton of different native insects, and in coastal regions, it can be somewhat damaging. I love the gray zones, keeps things interesting. Then we can go into something else. So forgetting the fact that we might not want to plant something that causes hay fever, I can tell you that oaks are top of the list. What if you live in an oak forest? Probably doesn't make sense to be planting another oak tree if you happen to live anywhere near where I live, which is pretty much dominated by oaks. And then it comes down to our actual specific goals for the landscape. You've got a vegetable garden. I'm telling you to plant oak trees. Sticking an oak in the middle of your tomato patch is probably not a great idea either. This is where kind of bringing humans into the picture is really important. Because if we just really talk specifically only about building habitat and forget the fact that humans need to be a part of that habitat, we're going to build landscapes that we can't really function on. And in that case, people are going to say, well, that was a bad idea. They're going to bulldoze all our work and put the golf course back in place. So we need to kind of keep in mind, how can we build habitat while also being a part of the landscape? So let's talk about plants that do that well. Instead of just throwing things into alphabetical order, I'm going to try and break things down into groups. These are the different groups we're going to be looking at today. Each one should make a little bit more sense as we start getting into it. So let's get that started. It Will Be Beautiful is going to be plants that easily can find their way into just about any garden space you can think about. These are plants that people don't need to know or care about pollinators or habitat or native. These are showy plants. This is often the gateway drug to ecological landscaping. Someone will come up to me and say, listen, I really don't care about any of this. I just want pretty flowers. I can give them a garden full of pretty flowers that also happens to be extremely valuable from a habitat point of view. So if anyone is furiously jotting this stuff down, there's a handout associated with this lecture. If you don't have it already, I'll show you a link at the end of the lecture where you can get it. So all these plants will be listed. In this picture here, this was a coastal sandplain garden that I built back when I was at Garden in the Woods. Moving from the top down, you've got black-eyed Susan, specifically Rudbeckia hirta. There's a lot of species that go under the name black-eyed Susan. Asclepias tuberosa, the butterfly milkweed, that's the orange one in back. Yellow wild indigo, Baptisia tinctoria, that's your kind of puffy yellow one, towards the front. And then on the bottom there is our native eastern prickly pear. So, plants that are fantastic for wildlife, but also really beautiful. Helianthus divaricatus, the sunflowers in general. I'm not going to lump in the kind of the garden sunflower, Helianthus annuus, which is a southwestern annual species. Still a fine plant to grow, but doesn't quite, kick in the way our native sunflowers do. We've got a number of native sunflower species that are really, really kind of high in your rankings for valuable plants from that ecosystem point of view. If you start kind of listing things out and you ignore all the woodies for a moment and just talk about the herbaceous species, Our native sunflowers, I believe, are number 4 on the list. I'll get to 1, 2, and 3 as we go, so I'm just going to leave them kind of hidden for the moment. But number 4 is high up there of, something like 4,000 potential species. The sunflowers are fantastic. This one here, Helianthus divaricatus, is the woodland sunflower. Don't let the name fool you. It does not grow in woodlands. It grows on the edges of woodlands. It'll handle a little bit of shade, but this isn't a plant for wooded areas. We'll get to those later. This plant can be somewhat vigorous, and by somewhat I mean quite a bit vigorous, especially if given sunny, moist conditions. It's a great plant for situations like this that you're seeing in this picture here. This is a good, pretty much informal hedge. It's on the side of a road. It's in a place where, on the other side of this hedge was a public beach. They wanted a bit of a block. This plant is great for that. There's a lawn of sorts in front of it that people kind of mow that keeps it from moving too far on you. If you're looking for a plant to fill in a difficult area, or you want something that can really spread, one area that I think this is great is drainage ditches. This can just colonize entire drainage ditches. Really good at filtering water. Also a fantastic, pollinator plant. Helianthus decapetalus, the thin-leaf sunflower. I don't know who named this plant. It's got 2 names, thin-leaf sunflower and 10-petal sunflower. It does not have thin leaves, and there are not 10 petals on it, so I'm not sure what they were thinking. But the nice thing about this is it's pretty much the better behaved brother to Helianthus divaricatus. They can look very, very similar in function, but if you like the idea of a native sunflower and don't have the place for a strong spreading plant, Helianthus decapetalus is probably a better option for you than Helianthus divaricatus. Both fantastic species. Helianthus tuberosus, this is the plant that we tend to know as sunchoke or Jerusalem artichoke. This is one that I grow for edible purposes. It's also an extremely valuable pollinator plant. It is vigorous in the extreme. This is not a plant I recommend putting in any area where you don't want something that spreads strongly. It's quite effective at pushing back against invasive species. And if you're dealing with an invasive species, I will always take a native weed over an invasive species any day of the week. And I've used this one quite effectively to push back against would-be invaders. It's also one that I grow regularly, as I said, for food purposes. And I like growing this in large containers. Easier to contain. At the end of the season, I dump that whole container out. I go rooting through it, looking for these sorts of tubers. The big ones come into the kitchen with me. The little ones go back in the pot, fresh soil, do it all again next year. And it's a great way to grow a plant and keep it somewhat contained when you don't have a ton of space for it. These plants are hosts for a variety of different insects. I'm going to try and call out some specific ones as I go through the different species. Not everyone will have a call out, but some of them will. The giant leopard moth, this is one that we found at Garden in the Woods, actually eating the sunchokes. This was one found by one of our cashiers back when, I can't remember who found this thing, but they showed it to me. I got very excited, took the picture, and now we've got, it's a wonderful species. It's one of the ones we would kind of consider a semi-specialist. Will feed on a small number of different genera. Lonicera sempervirens, I can't think of another plant, native or not, that blooms longer than the trumpet honeysuckle. This thing usually starts blooming in early to mid to late June, depending on how cold or warm the season is, and will bloom through June, through July, through August, through September, and sometimes into October. It just blooms and blooms and blooms. It's also one of the preferred nectar sources for the hummingbirds, and I've yet to meet anyone who doesn't actually like hummingbirds. This is a great, it's technically a liana, which just means it's a woody plant that acts like a vine. Great on chain link fences, great on anything that it can climb. It's a twining plant, so it's going to need to wrap around stuff, so it won't climb on, say, a brick wall. That being said, if you have a flat space and you want this to climb, just put up a trellis. If you've got a tree trunk you want to climb it on, a couple nails and some chicken wire, and it's going right up it. It's a fantastic plant. This is it at Garden in the Woods. This was at the Hort building. We would prune this guy once every probably 5 or 6 years, just kind of hack it back and let it kind of regrow to keep that kind of big open sort of, vase-like form that we like so much. And during the bloom season, we would be dive bombed by hummingbirds pretty much every time we walked into the office, which I kind of thought was pretty cool. These are the fruits that come later in the season. By the time it starts fruiting, the hummingbirds tend to leave it alone and the songbirds show up and start eating the fruits. The fruits will start off in the kind of green range, then go yellow, orange, red, and you get this kind of 1 week period where you get this kind of multicolored effect that's pretty cool before they mature to just a solid red. These are not considered edible to humans. They're argued as somewhat medicinal. If you ever need a really strong natural laxative, trumpet honeysuckle is not a half bad choice. But for the most part, leave this one to the birds. This is a host plant for the Cecropia moth. Cecropia moth is one of my favorite moths. These things look like something out of a Dr. Seuss book. Really, really cool insects. They turn into a beautiful, one of the many silk moths of our native kind of spectrum. They are stuck somewhere between specialist and generalist. They have a pretty wide range of plants that they will feed on, but they're all natives. Most of them are native trees, and trumpet honeysuckle is one of the exceptions to that rule. St. John's wort is a genus that is somewhat overlooked. Unfortunately, we have one very common St. John's wort around here. It's not a native species. It is sometimes considered problematic. I know that in agricultural settings, it can be considered a weed and can kind of get into farm fields, and I've heard some farmers call it invasive. I don't think it's technically an invasive species, but that's Hypericum perforatum, not the one we're looking at here. It's a non-native species, as I said. We do have a selection of native St. John's worts that are almost entirely overlooked in the horticultural industry, which is really a shame because there's some fantastic species in the mix. This is one of my absolute favorites. This is Hypericum prolificum. It's a shrubby species. By that I mean it gets woody. We pretty much have two woody species that I recommend using. Hypericum prolificum, this one here, will grow anywhere from, well, it wants sun, and it'll do the driest of dry sites. It'll do very, very thin soils, well-drained gravel, grit, sand, whatever. As long as it's sunny, it'll grow there. It doesn't really want wet soils. If you have a wet area and you want a St. John's wort, go for the other woody species, Hypericum densiflorum. Both of them will grow fine in average garden soils, but if you've got a particularly dry spot, you want the shrubby. And if you've got a particularly wet spot, you want the one that's called the bushy St. John's wort, densiflorum. Both of them get to be about, 3.5 to 4 feet tall, about the same in width, pretty rounded in size. They're covered in many, many, many small nickel to dime size, yellow flowers. The bees go absolutely nuts for this plant. This is important food, not just for generalist bees, but also for quite a few of our specialized bee species. This is one on the kind of the special list. If anyone's been looking into bees lately, you probably know the name Dr. Robert Gagier. He's been doing a lot of work on kind of identifying our rare bumblebee species and tracking their kind of population dynamics. This is one of the plants on his short list. Hypericum acirum, this is the greater St. John's wort. This is a herbaceous species, non-woody. These guys will get quite tall, 5.5, maybe 6 feet tall. Usually doesn't really bush out much. They're just going to stand tall. They tend to grow in meadows, sometimes wet, sometimes dry. They tend to do just fine in really dry, sunny spots. In general, St. John's worts mostly do well in sunny, dry spots. Not all, but mostly. This one has the largest flower of any of the St. John's worts in the native flora. In general, they have numerous small flowers, and this is, again, there's exceptions to every rule in the plant world. This has flowers in the size of kind of the silver dollar range. Again, loved by the bees. When these things are in bloom, they're just buzzing with bee activity. Also a host plant for a very, very cool caterpillar, the camouflaged emerald. The camouflaged emerald is not actually purple. What they will do is they will pick off parts of the plant that they're feeding on, use it to literally camouflage their body so that they could feed while hopefully being hidden from the native birds that are looking to make a meal out of them. Okay, it doesn't need to be hard. And what I mean by that is these are plants that are pretty much surefires. If you've got challenging conditions or you want plants that are going to grow pretty much no matter what the conditions, this is a group that are going to have plants that really can survive just about anywhere. A lot of these are what I would consider the tried and true species of the native spectrum. The chokeberries are a terribly underutilized genus. I think part of it is that some idiot named them chokeberry, and that's just a terrible name. These days, this is sometimes treated as the new superfood. Ocean Spray is actually growing out tons of these things. But whenever you hear it labeled as a superfood, it's never labeled as chokeberry. It's always labeled as aronia berry, because aronia berries are apparently, the important. Sorry there. Aronia berries are your, superfood, and chokeberries are your, well, chokeberries. You got two native species, maybe a third, depending on which taxonomist you want to argue with. red chokeberry and black chokeberry. They're named after the colors of the fruits. So you get these flowers in the early season. You get these edible fruits in the midsummer, edible, if not very tasty. And then you get this fantastic fall color that comes into the late season. This is one of many native plants that we could just rename burning bush. These are great replacements for the invasive species. So the black chokeberry is considered the more edible of the two. It's a little bit sweeter in flavor. And there actually have been quite a few cultivars developed for food production, which knock down a little bit of the bitterness in favor of a little bit more of the sweetness. Red chokeberry is usually argued as the more ornamental of the species, especially when the leaves are still green. Those red berries really pop quite nicely and can really add a nice kind of context to the landscape. These are plants that naturally grow anywhere from standing water bog-like conditions into, I see these all throughout Martha's Vineyard, Cape and Islands, very sandy soils. They can do a good deal of shade, although when they start getting very shady, they get leggy and they bloom a lot less often. So I would say anywhere from part sun to full sun, anywhere from dry soils to wet soils. If you want to plant them in dry soils, you're going to need to help them get established for that first year, give them plenty of water, get them through the first winter. After that, they will be fully, kind of rooted in, and they should be perfectly fine in that dry site for the rest of their lives. I love the goldenrods. I've always loved an underdog, and goldenrods get a bad rap for some slightly legitimate reasons and a whole lot of illegitimate reasons. First off, they are blamed for hay fever. Goldenrods have nothing to do with hay fever. Nothing other than the fact that they bloom at the same time as ragweed, which does cause hay fever. The reason goldenrods get the bad rap is that ragweed is a wind-pollinated flower. And the reason that's important is that, first off, in order for us to get hay fever, it means we're breathing in wind-borne pollen. We're breathing in pollen that's just floating around on the air. Goldenrods are producing a showy flower because they need an insect. They need a bee to come along, pick up pollen from that plant, bring it on to the next plant. The pollen is too heavy and too sticky to ever simply float around on the air. That means if you want to get some sort of allergic reaction to goldenrod, you need to take this flower, shove it up your nose, and inhale deeply. It's not something you're simply going to breathe in on the air, unless you breathe in a passing bee, then you might get it. But they bloom at the same time as ragweed, and the wind-pollinated ragweed has small green to creamy flowers that we really don't notice. And at the same time, we see this bright yellow thing blooming all over the place. And so we put two and two together and say goldenrods cause hay fever. Goldenrods don't cause hay fever. In fact, there's some evidence that they could help to alleviate hay fever if used correctly. The other bad rap they get is they're labeled as weeds. There are 53 species of goldenrods native in New England. There are a couple that easily could be labeled as weeds. There's also a couple that are so delicate that I've been trying for years to get them to grow unsuccessfully. And there's about 8 or 10 species in that kind of Goldilocks range that are strong enough to be good contenders in a built landscape, but not nearly strong enough to ever be labeled as a weed. And species like downy goldenrod, which could arguably be my favorite species. This is a plant that'll grow anywhere from full sun into partial shade. It'll do very, very dry sites, whether it be in full sun or partial shade. It's one I see growing on kind of woodland trail edges where there's a little bit of extra light coming in because of that trail. It's also one I see in open meadows. Goldenrods are literally top of the list when it comes to the diversity of species supported in the herbaceous plant spectrum. There is not a single other plant out there other than woodies that beats out the goldenrods in terms of life supported. They are extremely valuable plants. The downy goldenrod here is a nice tight clumper. It's not one that's going to run amok in a garden space. It's easily a plant to bring into your landscape. Silverrod, Solidago bicolor, the only white flowering goldenrod. This one actually can look almost identical to Solidago puberella. Same size, same shape, same bloom time. The only difference being that it's got a white flower. Which is kind of nice because when the two of them grow next to each other, which happens somewhat regularly in the wild, you get what amounts to yellow spikes and white spikes all kind of, mixed into each other. Puts on a heck of a show. Solidago cassia. In general, goldenrods want as much sun as they can get. This is one of those exceptions. Solidago cassia is a woodland goldenrod called wreath goldenrod, axillary goldenrod, sometimes called blue-stemmed goldenrod or blue-jointed goldenrod. It's the problem with common names. There's 1,000 of them out there. This is a fantastic plant for a nice bright yellow spot in any dark woodland. What's nice about it is it will grow well in dry acidic shade, which is a tough spot to fill. And this is one that does quite well in there. It's also one that will do perfectly fine in full sun. Solidago speciosa, this is called the showy goldenrod. It is arguably the showiest goldenrod out there. This one, like the downy goldenrod, both have these wand-shaped flowers, so they stand erect, a little bit rounded at the top, instead of your typical goldenrod flower that is, kind of the nodding sort of capitula. This is a species that is pushier than the others I've mentioned, but not nearly pushy enough to kind of fall into the weed category. I use this often in meadow conditions where there's a lot of competition going on and you need a plant that can kind of push back against its neighbors. But if you have a more traditional garden, where you've got space in between all your plants and you want to maintain this one's just going to take up as much space as you give it. So it's a plant for the right place. Not nearly as vigorous as something like Solidago rugosa or Solidago canadensis, which are probably the species that give the goldenrods, kind of their name as being weeds. But this one's definitely got some pushing power to it. Okay, so the dogwoods. They were Cornus, now they're being called Suida. I've heard arguments that they should be going back to Cornus. The taxonomists love to argue. I'm going to get out of the argument, but whatever name you know it as, the dogwoods are great species. Gray dogwood doesn't get enough attention. It's got a much larger and showier flower than really any of the other species. We don't tend to think of the woody, the shrubby dogwoods for their flower effect, but gray goldenrod really can do it. It's got a really cool fruit set that comes later in the season. The fruits mature pure white and they're housed on these red peduncles, and you get this great contrast of colors. It's really quite attractive. The nice thing about the shrubby dogwoods is that at any point, if they're getting too tall or out of hand or get damaged, you can just cut them right to the ground as if they were a perennial. It makes it really useful. I find myself using them under drip lines somewhat regularly. People tend to want a woody species up against the foundation, maybe to hide an ugly foundation or kind of soften the look of the house. But if you don't have gutters, and especially in the New England winters, you can get a lot of snowfall coming down, smashing your shrubs. It can be a real pain in the butt. Nice to have shrubs you can just hack back to the ground and know they'll come back from it every single time. And the dogwoods are great for that. One of my favorite species easily, Suida sericea. This is the red twig dogwood. There are not too many plants that look better than a red twig dogwood in the dead of winter. Especially on a white landscape, those red twigs can really pop quite nicely. Can put on quite a show. If they ever start looking brown on you, just cut the darn thing to the ground. You find that the brightest color tends to come on kind of 1, 2, 3-year-old twigs. After that, they start to brown up. And if you want that red, you just cut them down and they come back bright red. These are great plants for really just about any conditions you can think of, as long as it's not too shady. They love full sun. They'll do a little bit of shade. They're perfectly happy in moist to wet soils. Once established, they'll do average garden soils just fine. I wouldn't put them in a typically dry spot, although gray dogwood does pretty well in dry soils. Fall color on these is dependent on sun exposure. If they've got full sun, you can expect to get good fall color on them. If they're in partial shade, though the plants will grow just fine, you tend to lose your fall color. This is one of the few plants that is fed upon by the fragile dogwood bee. This bee is so specialized it gets the name dogwood in its name. It feeds exclusively on the dogwoods. I was about to say exclusively on the genus Cornus, but since they split that up, it'll feed on some of the other dogwoods as well. This is a very rare bee, not one you see around much at all, and you're never going to see it if you don't have dogwoods on your landscape. Okay. Don't assume anything is all the stuff that really surprised me when I started looking into what plants really do kind of support the pollinators. Before I started really getting to understand the concept overall, I was thinking pollinators are going to feed on flowers. You got to have flowers. And though flowers are an exceptionally important part of the puzzle, they're by no means all of it. And you'll find that plants like the little blue stem here are extremely valuable for pollinators, just not in the typical sort of sense. You're not going to see a bee on this. You're not going to see a butterfly on this. What you're going to see is a caterpillar. And that caterpillar is one that will not be found on many other plants. Panicum virgatum, northern switchgrass, another one of our many grasses that are extremely valuable for pollinators. It's the plant in the back of the picture here. This is a picture taken from the Martha's Vineyard Public Library. So for those of you who don't know, Martha's Vineyard is pretty much just a giant pile of sand. Very, very sandy soils, lots of sun exposure, dry sites, difficult conditions to grow, typical plants in. Panicum virgatum does very, very well in these conditions. Also in this picture is Pycnanthemum muticum, the broadleaf mountain mint, and I believe that one on the left is Amsonia. probably ciliata. It could be Vernonia lettermanii, but I think that's Amsonia, which is blue star. This is panicum in the late season. Our native clumping grasses can really put on a beautiful kind of fall display. They've got it's the color of New England in fall. They're rich shades of kind of orange and brown and red and yellow. And they're the sort of browns that make you realize that brown can be a really beautiful color instead of just, oh, it's brown. They're these sort of kind of golden hues that I really like. The pink streak would not exist without Panicum virgatum. The moth itself wants nothing to do with the panicum, but its caterpillar will feed on its leaves before then maturing into the pink streak that you're looking at here. The cool moth, one of the few ones that is named in a way that makes a lot of sense to me. You think plant names are weird. Start looking into the moth and butterfly names. There's some strange ones out there. They got us beat. The sumacs, often just thought of as weeds, they are some of my favorite weeds. I love the sumacs. They are, for the most part, with the exception being right here, but the other ones are strong spreading woody species. Not a plant for a small space, but great for highway medians, great for parking lot islands, great for, I put these in the middle of my meadows where they're going to be mowed every, 2 or 3 years, so that I can keep a strong spreading species in the center of the meadow and know that it's going to get hacked back every now and then. And so my meadow can stay intact and I can keep this great species in the middle of it. The sumacs are fantastic plants. You just need a plant for, that can spread strongly. This is a great choice. If you've got something like buckthorn or Japanese knotweed invading, stick a staghorn sumac next to it. It's not going to stop it in its tracks, but as you remove the invasive, the sumac will fill in, will help to keep it from coming back. Fragrant sumac is the one that is well enough behaved to come into any garden space. It is a mediocre spreader. It's tolerant of growing in the same difficult conditions that the other sumacs can grow in, but it's not one to kind of take over an area the way a staghorn or a shining or a smooth sumac will. This is it here in Cambridge. This is at the public water supply at Fresh Pond. This is almost certainly a cultivated form called Grollo. But this is their parking lot island. Parking lot on the right, road on the left. You can see the trees they keep trying to plant in the middle keep dying, and yet the fragrant sumac is doing just fine. Got a wonderful sheen during the growing season, and the fall color on it is really fantastic. One of the host plants for the showy emerald. Other sumacs that I think are absolutely wonderful but do need the right conditions. Rus typhina, the staghorn sumac. This is probably the strongest spreading species. Also one of my favorites by far. I love staghorn sumac. But again, know where you're getting into. Don't put this in a small area. You're just going to be battling it. That being said, if you live in the middle of Boston, you got a tree pit that the trees keep dying in, that's where we should be planting the staghorn sumacs. Or high, dry ridge tops where you have, very, very difficult conditions, not a lot of things growing. Sumac will grow there. Again, parking lot islands, green roofs, highway medians. Built landscapes with really challenging conditions where we need the vigor of a plant like a staghorn sumac. Fruiting in the late season, loved by the birds not only for the fruit, but after the fruits start kind of maturing and passing, also for the insects that find their way into the fruit. The birds will come back afterwards to eat all the insects. Fall color on these can be simply phenomenal. Makes me wonder why we ever planted burning bush. Rus copalinum, winged sumac, also sometimes called shining sumac. You can see the wing that runs right along the rachis, that central stem of the leaf gives it its name winged sumac, and you can see the sheen that gives it its name shining sumac. Fall color on this one can be absolutely, exquisite. That deep red color combined with that shine is just, this does it for me every time. I'm a sucker for anything shiny. We saw this guy before. This is the green metallic sweat bee. The sumacs are extremely valuable, both for the Lepidoptera and the caterpillars, but also for the bees. If you're unsure about this, the next time the sumacs start blooming, just hang out in front of a sumac flower for a little while. You look at it and you say, well, it's this many, many small green flowers, nothing that really attracts us from, a really visual point of view, but you will see it just buzzing with life. I'm not sure if it's the smell or if they're seeing things we don't because they see in a different light spectrum or what it might be, but the sumac flowers are very well visited. This is a topic that comes up pretty much in every lecture I give these days. The American lawn is frankly just a stupid idea that needs to go away already. There's a lot of things that we could be doing better with that place. We talk about, habitat loss, and we talk about habitat construction and trying to rebuild healthy habitats. For the most part, every one of us have a space that we could do something better with. I'm not going to say that every single lawn in America needs to die, but I think a good 95% of them probably could. If you've got a lawn out front of your place that you're wondering what you're actually kind of keeping it for, this section's for you. We've got this strange idea that somehow this is a low maintenance situation. And when you start thinking about all the effort that goes into maintaining a lawn like this, you realize it's anything but low maintenance. You know, we have to water these things regularly to try and keep up this sort of, you know, kind of monoculture appeal. We need to fertilize them regularly. They have all sorts of insects and disease problems. So we're constantly dumping pesticides and fungicides. And then when the wrong grass gets in there, we're dumping herbicides to try and kill off the crabgrass. And if, you know, it actually starts to grow, you know, God forbid it's actually doing well, the first thing we do is to break out a mower and cut it down to size so it can never develop a good root system. We're stuck in this strange cycle that we really ought to get out of. So what I'm not into doing is telling you what is wrong without giving you an alternative. I want to talk about what we can do to change these sorts of things. So in my perfect world, I need a lawn replacement. I want a lawn that requires no supplemental water. This is a rule I put on any of my landscaping. It's one thing if you're growing vegetables, you know, food production, get a little bit of a pass, greenhouses, you know, artificial settings. But if we're talking about ornamental landscaping, I want to plant a plant and know that once it's established, it does not need water from me ever again. Same thing goes for nutrients. I don't see the point in fertilizing the landscape. There are plants that will thrive in just about any conditions you can think of in our area. So there's no need to put in plants that then require our sort of help in terms of additional water and additional nutrients. I want a lawn that feeds pollinators. I'm not okay with just saying, well, my lawn doesn't feed pollinators, but I got pollinator garden over there, so I'm okay. I want the lawn itself to be a part of the solution. If I'm bringing pollinators in, the last thing I want is them coming into contact with pesticides and herbicides. Another rule that goes across the board on my landscapes. And if it's going to play the role of a lawn, it's got to tolerate at least some foot traffic. And this ranges from site to site and person to person. You know, I talk to people a lot about killing lawns these days, and I'll say, I think you should get rid of your lawn. And they say, well, I can't. You know, my kids play on it, and you know, it plays a function. I say, okay, you know, let's figure out what we can do for you. How often do your kids play on it? What do they do? And you see the gears start turning, and they say, well, you know what? My youngest is 35, and he hasn't been home in 3 years, so I guess my kids don't play on it anymore. And you realize that, well, maybe you don't necessarily need a high foot traffic lawn. Maybe you walk across it every day to go check the mail. So, you know, light to moderate foot traffic. Or if you live where I live, you need a lawn that can handle free-range chickens and 2 dogs that like to dig, not to mention all the garden parties we have. So much higher kind of foot traffic. And this is a decision that each one of you can make. So what if you could have a lawn that looks like this without any watering, mowing, or fertilizer? This is the same plant twice. On the left, it's unmowed. On the right, it's mowed. This is our native Carex pennsylvanica, the native sedge that I mentioned earlier that supports 36 different species of pollinators. This is a fantastic, valuable ecosystem-based lawn. This plant naturally grows under pine trees in New England. And what that means in terms of what it can do, for us on the landscape, is it does not need good sun. So if you've got a lawn that's kind of dying in the shade, this is a great option for you, though it's perfectly fine growing in full sun as well. It's a rhizomatous spreader, which means if you've got, if you dig a hole in the middle of it, it fills right back in, which is really nice because it means that once you get a patch of this going, you can dig out chunks of it and move it to other areas and start other lawns or start to kind of, encourage more of this on your landscape. So it'll do shade, it'll do very thin soils. It naturally grows under pine trees in thin soils. So you don't need to truck in loads of compost and topsoil, and you don't need to fertilize, you do not need to water. And if you want to keep it short, you need to mow it once a year. It puts on all of its growth in the early season, and after pretty much now, it stops producing additional growth for the season. So if you were to go ahead and mow it now, it's going to stay at whatever height you mow it for the rest of the season. Which is really quite nice. If you don't mow it at all, this is as tall as it gets. Gives you that lush lawn look that I find really quite nice. This is a great plant for kind of light to moderate foot traffic. Occasional people stepping on it, no big deal. Occasional garden party, no big deal. But if you got free-range chickens and if your kids like to play soccer, this is not going to do the trick for you. That being said, this is the one that looks the most like an actual lawn. So if you live in, say, a housing complex, or if you've got the sort of neighbor that really cares about your lawn more than he should, this is one that can really work in those sorts of situations a little more effectively than some of the other alternatives that may function more effectively but not look quite like this.
Dan, is there a cost-sensitive way to purchase that?
All right, so the simple answer is no. There are well, yes and no. Cost sensitive, yes, if you've got time. If the advantage that a traditional lawn will still hold over any of the alternatives I'm about to give you is if you have bare soil and you want to build a lawn, you can go to the hardware store, buy some lawn seed, throw it down, and as long as you're watering it right, you'll get a lawn by the pretty much end of the season. This
Okay.
Carex lawn, you can't do via seed. Seed germination on it is quite low and seed availability is quite low. So the only real legitimate way to do it is by planting plugs. And that's more expensive. You know, those plugs range from 50 cents to $2.50 per plug, depending on who you're buying them from. Where the cost-effective thing can come into it is being that rhizomatic spreader that I mentioned, you don't need to do the whole lawn at once. In fact, I don't recommend doing that. Start small sections. If you do, say, a 10 by 10 foot section, or maybe just do a strip along your lawn, once that's established or even starting to establish, you can start taking pieces out of there and planting it in other areas. So you can kind of leapfrog as you go. It'll take longer, clearly, than doing the whole lawn in one run. But once it's started, you can just propagate your own. You don't need any special skills as a propagator or a greenhouse or anything. You can just do divisions right from one spot to the next.
Okay.
So with time on your side, it can be quite cost effective. If you want an instant gratification or a quick fix, it's an expensive investment. The nice thing is that that investment tends to pay itself off in the long term because mowing is minimal. Once a year at the most, you can get away with once every 3 years. It does not need watering, it does not need fertilizing, and it brings in all this life to the landscape, including supporting songbirds. Which is a great way to fight off our tick populations on the landscape, which is another added benefit of kind of building a healthier lawn instead of a sterile lawn. So
Right.
yes and no.
So would it be too late to order online and plant somewhere in southern New Hampshire?
It depends on your availability, really. It depends on the landscape, you know, the nursery and what's available. This is a plant that has been growing in popularity quite extensively since people have started using it for lawns. When I was at Garden in the Woods, when I first got there, before we kind of installed our own Carex lawn, we would sell maybe 10 or 15 2-quart pots of Carex pennsylvanica every year. When I left, we stopped selling them in larger sizes. They were only available in plugs. We would sell them in a tray of 50, and we would sell somewhere in the range of 1,500 every year. So the popularity is growing, and we would never, ever have plants left at the end of the season. It was always as soon as we had them available, they would sell out because people would be buying enough to do a lawn. So availability really ranges from one spot to the next. Garden in the Woods is, you know, the local source. North Creek Nurseries is a great option. They have large amounts of this stuff available, and they're happy to ship. You'll need a commercial account if you go through them, but if you're a member of a garden club, or if you can get together with a small group of people and get that minimum order number in together, then they tend to be happy to ship off to people. So my personal favorite is this one. This, as far as I'm concerned, is the lawn of the future. This is Fragaria virginiana. This is wild strawberry. This is, so I was talking earlier about ranking plants on, you know, most valuable based on that, you know, diversity of Lepidoptera. When aster became Eurybian, Ionactis, and Dolingaria, and all those other things, Fragaria, which was number 3, turned into number 2. This supports more life than any other herbaceous plant, with the one exception being goldenrods. So we've gone from a lawn that is an ecological disaster to a lawn that is one of the most supportive plants, literally, in our area. This is a fantastically usable lawn. It's also able to tolerate the abuse that the Carex pennsylvanica cannot take. This is what I'm doing at home. This can handle free-range chickens. This can handle digging dogs. This spreads quickly and can be quite cost-effective because of the fact that it can fill in so quickly. The flip side to that is the vigor of this plant is what allows it to spread quickly and also, you know, handle the abuse that you might be able to give to this thing. So if you have, say, a lawn that's adjacent to a nice, delicate little garden bed, this lawn is moving into your garden bed. That makes it actually quite effective as a ground cover when your bed is full of woody species or clumping, you know, meadow-like species. You know, it's not going to outcompete something like Joe Pyeweed or bee balm or garden phlox. But if you have wild strawberries coming in your hepaticas, you will shortly have a lot less hepaticas and a lot more wild strawberry. So again, figuring out your placement is important on this. That being said, if you want something that can handle just about anything you'd throw at it in terms of a lawn, Fragaria virginiana is huge. It is a great plant. It blooms in the spring. It produces an edible berry in the midsummer that tastes absolutely fabulous. And it can handle just about any abuse you can throw at it. I also want you to notice, if you look at the picture here, the one on the right, ignore all the berries and look at the leaves. Notice how ratty those edges are. That is the value of this plant. The flowers are visited by some generalist bees, and clearly you're going to have, birds and chipmunks and so forth, humans and my dog eating those, berries. But the real value, the reason why this plant is so, ecologically viable is in those leaves. And in my area, at least 87 different species of Lepidoptera that will feed on those leaves that could then turn into 87 different butterflies and moths, or turn into 87 meals for the local chickadees and any other bird that finds them. This is, as I said, I think the lawn of the future. Okay, so how's my timing? Running a little short on timing, so I'm going to kind of run through the last of these and open us up for questions. This section is about us eating. There's nothing saying that we can't also eat on the landscape while providing food for the rest of the landscape. When you start thinking about the fact that I keep mentioning the leaves being so valuable, you could say, oh, wait, I can plant a blueberry plant and eat every single blueberry and not leave any of them for the birds, as if you can get them all before the birds get to them. But you could do that and know that the blueberry is still valuable on the landscape. This is why kind of growing native edibles can be a really important part of building healthy habitats. It also decentralizes our food system, which means less of a reliance on large-scale agriculture, which is one of the major drivers of habitat loss in our country. So the raspberries are easily some of my favorites. I'm sure a lot of people realize raspberries are quite vigorous. So again, decide where to plant them. I like to plant them in these long kind of strips. That actually strip there is turned into grapes. But the one in the back is the raspberries. Nice thing about these strips is as they start trying to grow outside of my strip, I just hit them with the mower. So instead of, kind of pruning by hand and donating blood to the garden, the maintenance goes down quite a bit with just kind of a mow job. Red raspberry, my favorite species. If you eat with your eyes first, the color on these always does it for me. That beautiful balance between tart and sweet. Black raspberry, easily the sweetest of our native raspberries. These are, some of the cultivars out there are just cloyingly sweet, but I think the natural species, and there are also some very good cultivars out there, have, again, that great balance between tart and sweet. Blackberries are my choice when it comes to baking. They tend to be additionally tart, and I really like that in baked goods. It's easy to add, kind of sugar or honey or maple or whatever you want. It's easy to add sweetness. It's hard to add tart without just squeezing lemon juice into all your baked goods, and I don't want everything tasting like lemon. And so I love the blackberries for the baked goods. Flowering raspberry, which really plays the role nicely in between edible and ornamental. Unlike the other raspberries, this one blooms pretty much all summer long. The stems are armed with just stiff hairs, no thorns on this one. It's a little less vigorous than the other raspberries, a little more kind of tolerant of being grown in garden settings without, say, really taking a space over. This is one also that can handle quite a bit of shade, which is something really the other species don't do well. Raspberries feed so many different things. They're important nesting habitat for birds. They're important food habitat for birds. They're important habitat for the scribe moth and a variety of other moths as well. The blueberries, as I mentioned, have a lot of value outside of the berries themselves. The flowers here are exceptionally important bumblebee food. They are the Ericaceae. The heath family is really a bumblebee pollinated family. If you like your bumblebees, plant your heaths, your blueberries, your huckleberries, your rhododendrons. They're all valuable plants in that kind of family. We've got our lowbush blueberry, Vaccinium angustifolium, that'll grow anywhere from full sun to full shade in dry to average garden soils. Highbush blueberry will grow in the same dry soils, but it'll also do fine in average or wet soils. Doesn't do as well in full shade, but a little bit of shade isn't a big deal. Oh, I don't have the other blueberries in here. Oh yeah, it's the 1 hour version, not the 6 hour, and I'm running out of time anyway. But cranberries, deerberries, dangleberries, an unfortunate name, but still a good berry. There's a lot of other good ones out there as well. Spicebush. Spicebush is always on my list because this is the host plant for, there he is, the spicebush swallowtail. And for anybody who is a little squeamish around insects, this is a really good introductory insect. They are arguably one of the most adorable caterpillars on the planet, and it's one that can be found with kids and introduce them to the importance of pollinators and the importance of caterpillars and kind of this greater realm that plants play on the landscape in attracting additional life. These are fantastic caterpillars. They're easy to find if you know how to do it. Ask me afterwards when we got a little bit more time, and something that I think every kid should come into contact with. Hook them when they're young. It can lead towards the next generation of ecologists and arborists and horticulturists and all these other kind of ists that we need on the landscape. The bigger the better is exactly what it sounds like. Trees. We talk a lot about, all these different herbaceous plants. Goldenrod's top of the list for herbaceous plants, supporting 123 different species. Native strawberries host 77. That was back when I was in Framingham. It's actually 87 here in Phillipston, Massachusetts. Oaks support 470, 512 here in Phillipston. As you can see, these numbers range a little bit depending on your location. So when you start looking at goldenrod literally being top of the list at 123, and then you see oak supporting 470, you realize that the bigger is better in this case. Compare that to something like a bee balm, which is a valuable pollinator plant that supports 8 species. 8, 123, 470, these numbers really do matter. So plants that we don't talk about as much, though. Salix discolor, the pussy willow, this one was all the rage back in the 80s, and for some reason it went out of style. This is one that still gives me nostalgia because it was at the bottom of my driveway back when I lived in Connecticut. My mother didn't even know what it was. She just said, that's the fuzzy plant. For years I didn't know what it was. It took me years later to figure out, oh, we had a pussy willow all that time. I didn't know. They're wonderful plants. Another great one to get kids involved with. Anything you can touch and feel and really come into contact with, I think is a good thing. It's why I recommend people eat plants as much as possible. It's a very direct connection between people and the landscape. Good shrubby species. This is one that if it gets too tall on you, just cut it right to the ground and it'll resprout and just form another shrub for you. Something that I do on a every 5 to 8 year basis just to keep it within pretty much child's height. Probably my favorite willow, this is black willow, Salix nigra. This turns into, in some cases, a 100+ foot tree. But just like the pussy willow, if this thing's getting too big on you, you can cut that 100-foot tree down and it'll resprout. It'll resprout and look like the guy on the right, which as far as I'm concerned, at least from a distance, looks like bamboo. And people like bamboo. And bamboo is definitely problematic in our area. So it's nice to have some good native alternatives. It's not bamboo, it's a willow. Which means that it provides this ecosystem function that most of the running bamboos really destroy. This is a plant that I think can work in informal hedges. It's a plant that naturally grows in wetland areas, is perfectly fine with standing water, but is also fine growing in average garden soils. This one is, if I remember correctly, I believe it's either number 2 or number 3 on the list, depending on where you are in location. The cherries and the willows kind of, bounce up and down on which one's more valuable, depending on which part of the country you're in. Speaking of the cherries, black cherry, this is I would probably argue the tastiest of our native cherries, not lumping the native plums that are actually a prunus in with the mix. This is a plant that's often just thought of as a weed tree, which is somewhat unfortunate. It's a pioneer species. It's one of the first plants that shows up in meadows as they're going from meadow back towards forest. And so a lot of people just kind of label them as weed trees, which is really not fair. Beautiful flowers in the kind of spring. They're starting to bloom right now. They don't last long flower-wise, but you get a berry in the later season that's quite nice. Prunus virginiana is not talked about enough. Choke cherry, also called bird cherry. Flowers on this one last a bit longer than the black cherry. I think this one's got a lot of horticultural value that's just not recognized. This is a shrubby species. Depending on conditions, can grow anywhere from 5 to 8 to 12 to 15 feet tall, depending on how dry and sandy your soils are. And like the willows we just talked about, if it's getting too big on you, just cut it down. It'll come right back from it, and it's a good way to kind of reset it every couple of years to keep it shorter if that's your desire. Black cherries mature into black. The berries tend to be quite tasty every now and then. You bite into one that's just tart, but quite a few of them can be really sweet and really nice. Choke cherries are the other end of the spectrum. They're almost all very, very tart, and occasionally you bite into one that's really quite sweet. And I think there's some potential for some cultivation on this one as an edible species. If we can cultivate some really tasty ones, we can start seeing this plant as a typical addition to farm, homestead, backyard food production sort of conditions. These are fed upon by the cuckoo bee. The cuckoo bee is, to put it bluntly, the little asshole of the bee world. These are bees that will go into a nest that's been prepared by a different species of bee. They will remove the eggs that were left there and place their own eggs in its place. The other bee had already put in a little pollen cake, so when the eggs hatch, they've got something to eat. The cuckoo bee does none of the work and just go drops its eggs in there, and you can either call them a little asshole, or you could say it's an ingenious strategy for surviving on the landscape. And additionally, they are important pollinators on the landscape and absolutely love our native cherries. Last thing I want to talk about before I open it up to questions, sorry about going over a little bit here, the idea of fall cleanup. So I got into landscape from pretty much the other end of the spectrum from where I'm at now. I came in on mow and blow crews. We planted a lot of invasive species. We spread a lot of mulch. We pruned everything into meatballs and rocket chips. We did everything I would tell you not to do now. We made a lot of money doing fall cleanups. The general idea is a messy landscape is a living landscape, and a clean landscape is, for the most part, a sterile landscape. So on the spectrum of beautifully clean, sterile to complete mess and full of life, I want to push people further over towards the messy landscape, and you could decide where on that spectrum you want to lie and what works for you. But kind of keep in mind that the messier it is, in general, the more life that's there. So why? First off, leaving plants up for the season can really be better for the plants themselves, especially if we're talking about something that was just planted in the late season and may not be fully established, or if we get one of those really difficult winters. And what I mean by that tends to be very cold but very dry, not a lot of snow cover, not like the picture here. Those can be real killers on plants. And what leaving plants standing can do is what little snow we get will accumulate on the stems of the plants there. Then as the sun heats it up, it'll start to melt and it'll slide down that stem and land right on the crown of the plant where that insulation is needed most. Leaving a plant standing and that extra snow insulation being directed towards the center of the plant can be the difference between surviving and not in a difficult winter. In terms of our birds, that's free bird seed. I'll never understand why we go cut back our gardens in the fall and then go to the store to buy bird seed. Our gardens are full of bird seed. Here it's Monarda fistulosa, one of our native bee balm species. And whether it be a bee balm or an aster or golden water, one of the native sunflowers, or really you name it, this is valuable bird seed that is chock full of important lipids, proteins, oils, the sort of things that birds need in the wintertime. So leaving that stuff standing is really valuable bird food. In terms of our bees, about 2/3 of them nest in the ground over the winter, but the last remaining third nest in standing, dried, mostly herbaceous stems. And if we cut those stems back and remove them, it means we remove that habitat from the landscape. Leave the stems up and you've left an overwintering spot for 1/3 of our native bees, which means more life on the landscape. Butterflies don't want the standing stems. What they want is the leaf litter. And not all of them. The butterflies are less consistent than the bees in how they overwinter. But you'll find a number of them overwintering in the leaf litter. Some of them as caterpillars, like the woolly bear here that I'm sure a lot of people recognize. Some of them as eggs, some of them in their pupal form. It kind of depends on which species, but the leaf litter is in many cases an important overwintering habitat for our butterflies and our moths and our salamanders. And it's better for seedlings. There's a lot of plants that distribute their seed in the late season, holding some of it in those kind of dried stems or in the dried fruiting bodies until the winter comes in. The reason why they do that is once we have a snow cover on the ground, if seed lands on top of that snow cover, especially if it's a kind of crusty snow, a little bit of wind can distribute that seed great distances. It's a good strategy for spreading your seed. So when you're leaving these kind of seed heads up in the winter, you find stuff like this in spring. That's Rudbeckia hirta. That's a free plant. That means that your weeds in the garden, the things that just pop up on their own, become things like black-eyed Susan, columbine, lobelias, spotted bee balms, the sort of plants that I want kind of popping up on the landscape. I would much rather have a whole bunch of black-eyed Susans showing up than a whole bunch of dock and chickweed and mullein. And finally, just coming on to us, it looks cool. This has nothing to do with habitat. This is the fact that I like looking out on my landscape in fall and seeing things like Anemone virginiana here. This is thimbleweed. This is one that will start maturing in July and will kind of start getting puffy by September, October, and it'll hold through at least the first part of the winter. And if we were to cut this thing back in, October, you wouldn't see these fruiting heads during the winter time. And it makes for an interesting landscape. So with that in mind, I do apologize for going a little bit over. If you don't already have the handout, you can find a link to it on my website. I'm guessing we've got a whole bunch of questions. So Corey, if you want to kind of take over and lead me towards questions, we can tackle them. What do
Yeah,
we got?
sure. Thanks, Dan. We have a couple of burning questions, such as what plants attract hummingbirds and butterflies, but not bees, because some folks are definitely allergic to bees.
All right, so I'll give you a kind of a two-part answer to that. First off, bees are not going to bother you unless you give them a good reason to. If you sit on one, if you swat at them, clearly that's going to cause an issue. But you'd be amazed at how many times I've walked through meadows just chock full of bees, and they're literally bouncing off my chest, bouncing off my head, and I can literally count the number of times I've been stung on one hand. I've been stung 4 times. Once I put my hand down on a bee and crushed it and got stung. Twice I sat on bees and got stung. And one other time, I don't know why, but it stung me. So bees are not going to sting you unless you give you a reason to. That being said, there's still some good answers for your question in terms of the plants. Bees want something specific. Let me back up a little bit and find you pictures to show you in addition to this. Let me find a good, what do we got? So bees want a certain type of flower. They want an open flower, kind of broad. Let me go back to my, here. Sunflowers are a really good example of this. Oh, Hypericum, this will work well. Bees need a good landing pad. So notice here, especially on a siren, you've got a nice open flower. You got these broad petals, good place for a bee to land, and it can kind of crawl in and feed upon this pollen here, get its good pollen. They need that open flower. Bees, even the long-tongued bees, don't have a very long tongue compared to something like a hummingbird or a butterfly. So these open, broad flowers are bee-pollinated flowers. Compare that to our trumpet honeysuckle, and you've got these long tubular flowers. So those tubular flowers are fed upon by hummingbirds with their long, narrow beak, or with butterflies that have a tongue that literally rolls up in their head that they can unroll and kind of stick into this thing. So if you're looking for plants that support as many of your butterflies, moths, hummingbirds, and not your bees and wasps and hornets, look for nice, long, tubular flowers, and that's really your kind of kit. Color-wise, bees really like yellows and things in the blue range, whether that be purple or true blue or something in there. You find less bees on your red and your pink flowers. There's a lot of exceptions to that rule, but especially if you're finding something in the red and the pink range that has that tubular flower, you're in really good shape for not attracting bees and attracting everything else instead.
So we have a few questions that concern insects. So I'm going to give a bunch of questions at you at once, so maybe they'll all have a common answer.
All right, well, I'll give you a little bit of a warning beforehand. I'm a plant guy who's learning my insects, so I'll do my best.
Right, so one of them is, are grubs attracted to lawn alternatives as sedge? And is nut sedge in the same family as the one that you were mentioning earlier?
Okay, so let me tackle those two quickly.
Okay.
So in general, grub is a very, very, very broad term for a lot of different species. In general, when we mean grub, we tend to mean we're having a problem with grubs. We've got a lot of something that's eating. And that tends to come when you've got monocultures. So a lawn, for example, is just a mass of a single plant, and you've got more of an issue with that grubs-wise. I have never had grub problems in Carex pennsylvanica or Fragaria virginiana, despite the fact that they're getting closer towards a monoculture. Most of the grub issues are a European chafer beetle, its grub stage, or a Japanese beetle, both of which feed on our traditional European turfgrass. They're European species that feed on European plants. So grubs are a problem on traditional lawns. I have not yet ever had any problems with grubs in native lawn alternatives. I'm not going to say you'll never have a problem. I'm sure there's someone out there who's had it, but it's not a big problem. And nut sedge is not the same as the native sedges I was referring to. The sedges I'm referring to are the genus Carex. There's a lot of different good options out there, but when we're talking about a lawn alternative, it's specifically Carex pennsylvanica. It's not nut sedge. It's not invasive. It's not a weed. It's a good plant.
Great. Another one concerning insects is, do you have a plant group recommendations that deter ticks and their vectors? And Rose is asking, my high bush cranberry bushes have tiny larvae on the underside of the leaves. Will they kill the plant?
Okay, so let me take the second question first because that's the quick one. The high bush cranberry, I mean, without seeing the insect, I really couldn't tell you for sure what it is. The nice thing about the native insects, including the native herbivorous insects, the ones that eat our leaves, is that there's a balance. They've evolved in a way to not kill the plant, because if you kill your food source, that's not really good for your survival. For viburnums, what you need to watch out for is the viburnum leaf beetle. And that can be, really detrimental and quite a killer. It affects some of the viburnums quite badly, some of them not quite as badly, and some not at all. Cranberry viburnum, high bush cranberry, is one that's hit every now and then, but when it is hit, it tends to get hit hard. I've known some people who were never bothered by viburnum leaf beetle on them, and other people who had to stop planting them because of it. Just based on, chances, it's probably what you're looking at. It's a very common pest in this area, and that's one that really can be quite damaging. Viburnums I recommend planting that are never bothered by viburnum leaf beetle. Viburnum nudum, viburnum prunifolium, viburnum casinoides, viburnum acerifolium, occasional minor damage, but I've never seen any big damage on it. Viburnum lantanoides. These are all good choices. The old-fashioned snowball viburnum, which isn't a native species, gets decimated. Cranberry bush is hit or miss and can be really bad sometimes. And our native one that I've unfortunately gotten to the point where I don't recommend at all anymore is the arrowwood viburnum. All right, moving on to ticks. So ticks are clearly a problem on the landscape. I'm dealing with my second bout of Lyme disease in the past 3 months, which is really, I've never had it this often. So there are issues associated with ticks that are strongly connected to climate change. As our climate is changing, we expect to see many more ticks. We also expect to see more ticks carrying Lyme disease, and some of the less common tick-borne diseases are expected to become more common. Things like anaplasmosis, babesiosis, things like that. There's not much we can do about climate change on an individual basis. It's a problem we all need to tackle, and I think I don't need to tell you about climate change. We need to tackle that. On our own personal basis, what we can do to really combat ticks is to try and bring in as many tick predators as possible. There are certain animals that are really good at eating ticks. People talk about possums a lot. They are great on their own, as an individual animal, but on a large scale, the most valuable predator of ticks are songbirds. So the more we can do to support healthy songbird populations, the more we will have good tick control on the landscape. The other thing we can do is to remove invasive species, specifically barberry. Barberry harbors mice and therefore ticks quite readily, and there have been studies showing that the prevalence of barberry on the landscape can lead to a 30% increase of ticks on the landscape. And the weird thing that we still can't explain is that those ticks can carry Lyme disease 40% more commonly than ticks in the landscape without barberry. So remove barberry and support songbirds. That means building healthy habitat. That means doing everything we just talked about. There's an argument for a traditional lawn being a good deterrent for ticks. The argument comes into the way we treat our lawn. The fact that we are constantly spraying a bunch of herbicides and pesticides on it, and we've pretty much built a sterile landscape. And yes, a sterile landscape will be without ticks, at least in the very local landscape, but it's not a long-term solution because it's not going to actually control tick populations. It might just keep them off of your very close area. And it means treating your lawn in a way that I recommend people don't do. Assuming that you're listening to me now, you're probably not the sort of crowd that is, calling in True Green to spray your lawn every day with pesticides, in which case your lawn is going to be just as effective for tick habitat as anything else. It's going to encourage ticks. What it will not do is encourage tick predators. So support your native songbird populations. The songbirds will eat more ticks, and we can actually build tick controls into our landscape. Other questions?
Okay, we're going to take just 2 more questions in the interest of time, but I'm going to have Ed come to the floor, and I'm going to unmute you, and you can ask Dan your question.
Hi, so my name is Violet, and I have a question. Are violets invasive?
No, violets are not invasive. There are a bunch of different violets on the landscape. There are some native ones and there's some non-native ones. Frankly, most of the violets we see around, if you see a violet and you're not sure what it is and it's purpley blue and you point and say common blue violet or common woolly violet, you're going to be right about 85% of the time. It is the most common violet on the landscape. It spreads quite strongly, but it's a native species and actually one of the few host plants for the regal fritillary butterfly. Most of the violets on the landscape are native. There is a European violet and an English violet, both of which are pretty darn common on the landscape, that are not native, but neither one is considered invasive by any means. Just a bit more vigorous than we might want and not a native species. Violets are good survivors, I think is the best way to put it. They're quite good at spreading on the landscape. What I've always recommended to people is if it's not causing you any trouble, just leave it alone. And for the most part, violets, though they tend to spread quickly, are not ones to outcompete other plants. So if you've got a garden and you're having violets run all throughout it, and you just leave it alone and let the violets run all throughout it, you're going to have all the same garden plants you had before, plus violets. They're not ones that will destroy your garden by any means. If you are the sort of person that wants a cleaner look to your garden, you don't want violets in between everything and they keep coming in on you, the best strategy you can have for deterring violets is to put something else in the place that the violets would take. So they're pretty much acting as that filler in between your clumping plants. Put something else in there. Ground covers are really good options for this. Something like foam flower or green and gold or creeping phlox or really any ground cover that you like. And instead of having violets creeping in between everything, you will have foam flower or ground or whatever you choose. But violets are, for the most part, beneficial on the landscape. They're also pretty tasty.
Yeah, thank you.
So, thank you.
Thanks for asking.
All right, I'm going to have Leslie come to the floor.
Hi. My question was regarding clover versus grass for lawns, and what are your suggestions? Micro clover, any other kinds of clover? Just it seems to be the in vogue thing to do, and I hate my lawn.
Yeah, it's kind of funny as I talk to people about lawns and they start paying more attention to them, they realize I almost feel bad about it because you go from it's something you never really thought about to the more you think about it, the more you dislike it. So I do a whole class on lawn alternatives, and I talk about, you know, what I label as the perfect lawn, which is like the golf course sort of perfection. And then I talk about the fully native lawn, and then there's the middle grounds, which may or may not be native. There's some non-native, non-traditional lawns that are a pretty good middle ground in between the true native lawn alternative and that perfect golf course mayhem. So clovers are not native around here, at least. There are some native clovers in the Appalachian region, but I don't think any of them are really effective as lawn covers. But the typical white clover, which is not a native species, is about as good as a non-native species can get in terms of value on the landscape. It's not nearly as valuable as the wild strawberry or the carex, but it does have certain advantages over those in terms of building a lawn, namely time and money. So if you have that bare soil that you need to install a lawn on, you can install a traditional lawn, which can be done by sod or by seed or however, and pretty much have a lawn that's established within a single season. With our native alternatives, strawberries, within 2 years, you can have a lawn. Carex, probably 3 to 4 before it's a good lawn. Clover can be established just as quickly as a traditional lawn can. It's going to provide some decent food sources for some generalist insects, some including native generalists, and you can simply go to the store and buy seed and throw it down on the landscape. So there are certain advantages to that. I wish I could say that about Fragaria or, you know, the Carex. So I stick clover right in the middle as a pretty good alternative when you need to be able to do something pretty quickly, pretty inexpensively. To add to that kind of value on the landscape, if clover's sounding like a pretty good idea, making sure it's not just clover, but clover and maybe some good lawn violets, clover and self-heal, which is Prunella vulgaris subspecies lanceolata. It's a nice native plant that can work really well in clover lawns. Clover with some wild strawberries, clover with some Fragaria, which is wild strawberries, I said it twice, clover with some carex. Myantum canadense, our spreading Canada Mayflower, can work in amongst the clover. And you can start building a little bit of a low-grow kind of conglomeration of species where clover's a part of it, a good filler. It's a good middle ground.
What's Canada Mayflower? I've never heard of that.
Canada Mayflower is Myanthemum canadense. When you look up the picture, you're going to say, oh, I know that plant. It's a very, very common woodland plant around here. When I mentioned it for lawns, when we're talking about lawns in shadier areas, not great for foot traffic, but a good kind of low-growth filler plant that could work well under, say, trees or in shadier sections of lawns, and works fine growing in amongst clover. It's a very common woodland species, spreads very, very quickly, but also roots really, really shallowly. And what's nice about that is it means that despite the fact that it spreads much faster than everything else, it can't outcompete anything because they tend to root right underneath it. So it works well to fill in amongst other plants while still allowing those other plants to thrive.
Okay, good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Leslie. So in the interest of time, we will have to end the presentation. There's a lot of enthusiasm here, and I'm not alone if I say I'd like to see the 6-hour presentation because I could go all night.
You folks see my website up there, dantjaffe.com. There's a contact me feature on there. You're welcome to shoot me questions via the website, and I'll happily answer any of them that come my way.
We will be sending out a post-webinar email with resources, with the link to Dan's website and most of the plants that were mentioned tonight, along with some other resources. And I just want to make another plug for Mount Grace, is that Mount Grace is still doing our ongoing land conservation in Athol and in the North Quabbin area. If you are very interested in it, you will also find a link to the website and look into membership. For we always need land stewards who go out on trails, do some maintenance, and also looking for volunteers who are enthusiastic about this stuff. And with that, you'll be in contact with a whole network of folks just like Dan, myself, and other naturalists in the area. We're going to say goodnight. Dan, any last remarks?
I'll just second what you said. Support your local land trust. They're important kind of parts of this whole habitat. You know, we can't build habitat if we don't protect it in the first place.
Well said, yeah. Have a good night, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you all. Talk to you next time.